This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On this week's episode, we take a look back at 2021 with some choice selections from a number of different episodes. We kicked off Art Sense in June of this year and have thus far interviewed 34 guests over 26 episodes. Guests have included best-selling authors, museum curators, art historians, blue-chip artists, auction house execs, technology experts, crypto artists, and top collectors. Guest artists have included the likes of Sandy Skoglund, Marilyn Minter, Raymond Pettibon, Fischl, SWOON, and Mona Kuhn. But one of my favorite conversations with an artist was part of Episode 1. Episode 1 included two guests with ties to artist Andrew-Wyeth. One of those two guests was artist bo-bartlett. Bo is an extremely popular artist in his own right, who is represented by Miles McHenry Gallery in New York. But once upon a time, he was a project for Wyeth's wife, Betsy. As a result, Bartlett was asked to produce a documentary about Wyeth, which resulted in years of observations, long walks, and talks about life as a painter.
And I realized what a great painter he was. And so as we became friends and spent a lot of time together, he really encouraged me to not worry about the reviews, because he'd gotten so many negative reviews over the years, and to, just paint your life and paint your story and paint what you're excited by. And, I've said this before, but one time I was with him, I said, how do you stay motivated, year in, year out? You've had such a long career. How do you do that? And he said, oh, I'll just be going along and I'll see a piece of barbed wire with a piece of horse's mane stuck in it, and it'll just keep me going. It's like he gets excited by something as simple as a piece of barbed wire. I mean, that is the kind of meditation that we're not used to. We're like, 1 millisecond edits. If it's not exciting, we flip to the next thing, or, we don't have the patience, and we're just not contemplative enough to slow down enough. And I learned so much from him, because I really learned how to draw from Ben Long and how to paint from Nelson Shanks, but I didn't really know why to paint. And Andrew-Wyeth taught me why to paint. And it's, it's to tell your own unique story, and we all have our own unique stories. And so it's a universal. And he would start in his own backyard. I mean, he didn't have to go off somewhere far to find a subject matter. He would just wander off into his own backyard. I remember seeing him. I worked on the film in a little schoolhouse across the way from their house, and I would see him leave in the morning to go to his studio, and he'd be driving his Jeep down the driveway, and all of a sudden it would just pull off to the side and stop, like he had died or had a heart attack or something. And I'd like, what's going on, and he would just sit there for hours drawing. He wouldn't even get out of his driveway before he'd see something that excited him. He would be drawing some fence line or something. And then the next day, if he liked it, he'd come back again, and he would, bring his watercolor, and he would, and eventually he would get out. And if he liked it again, he would eventually get tempera and take it to the studio and take all his studies and make a painting of it. But he wasn't just painting some random thing. I mean, he was painting. He knew the tree that had been felled to make that fence. He knew the farmer that had cut that tree down, and it was a whole life. It wasn't just a scene. He was painting everything inside and out. So he took the microcosm of his life and made it universal, so that when people see it, they don't know why they're attached to it or drawn to it, but they are, because it's got his own genuine voice and his own genuine life in it. And he's not doing it for anybody else. He's doing it for the right reasons. And that's what's so rare. I think it's really rare. It's inward, and he said you have to be ingrown to be any good. That's what he told me. it's like, okay, you just think about that. And he says, I never show anybody anything I'm working on, because if they like it, it's a bad thing. And if they don't like it, it's a bad thing. So you realize you really just have to maintain this kind of contemplation and focus like a Zen master. And that's what he told me.
What is great about that story is this first-hand account of art history. We had the benefit of another such guest in episode 6. Philip-Larratt-Smith served as the literary archivist for the incomparable Louise-Bourgeois during her lifetime, and now serves as curator for the Easton Foundation, which works to maintain her legacy. Larratt-Smith curated a wonderful show at the Jewish Museum this year that looked at Bourgeois' work through the lens of her years in psychoanalysis and the writings she created in the process. In this clip, Larratt-Smith provides insight into a large cage-like sculpture by Bourgeois that was in many ways symbolic of her life.
Passage d'Anjou is the largest cell installation that Louise ever made. She began making them in the early 1990s. These are architectural installations that originally the viewer was meant to be able to enter and walk through. And they were made out of a combination of objects Louise had made and also objects that Louise had found, so found objects. And this was a shift for Louise because up until the 1990s, she predominantly made her sculpture. The beginning to use the found object is significant because it's as if Louise needed something that had a heightened sense of reality. So she would use the perfume that she wore throughout her life, Shalimar. She would use objects that she'd kept over the course of her life. Louise was a pack rat, so she had a lot of things from her early childhood that she took with her when she left France. And the way in which she orchestrates these installations is really to kind of recreate, I think, the originary scene of the drama. And Passage d'Anjou in particular is unusual among the cells because the cells in general deal with the themes of memory, desire, the five senses. Passage d'Anjou is really the only one that consists of multiple bays. So it really has that narrative element that you mentioned. And I think it unfolds almost to me like a dream sequence. Whenever I see it, I think it's, again, there's mechanisms of condensation and displacement, the way that she's tied different things together. You get a fragment of this and a relation to that. And so you're catching glimpses of something seen almost in a flashback. And I think the story that it tells in my interpretation is really the edible deadlock that was a central traumatic kernel of Louise's life. Louise was never able to liberate herself from the fixation, the unconscious fixation on her father. And this would play havoc in her relationships with men throughout her life. It was also possibly, part of the, at least a component part of her creativity. It informed her entire worldview. The insistence on the couple as a kind of fundamental structure of the world. I think that she, in a way, and it was through psychoanalysis that she really came to recognize, the lingering hold that this fixation had on her. And she wrote in a very late writing. They'll never let me be free from this burden that will never let me be free. So there's a kind of circularity to it. And it's as if it's a closed circuit that she can't fully get out of. And I think a lot of the cells have that feeling too. For all that they're open to different perspectives and they actually allow the viewer to have the pleasure of the voyeur looking in on something that's almost like a private scene, almost a little, I sometimes think of Duchamp's Étant donné, with this feeling of glimpsing something, or kind of like some sort of perversion or something that normally isn't presented to the view of others. But at the same time, I think it's Louise had really created this kind of closed symbolic world in which, she was able to, reenact these traumatic memories from the past, and partly in order to try to, to exercise them, but at the same time it was a way of holding on to them too.
Sure. I believe I read that it was originally conceived that to experience the work, you could pass through the cell.
That's right.
But ultimately, it was chosen that it would be viewed from the outside. And conceptually, I think, what would it be like passing through and experiencing that inside the cell versus viewing it from the outside? And I guess part of that kind of goes back to this whole nature of psychoanalysis, looking at your world from a first point perspective versus from the outside looking in.
I think one thing I would say about that is that the truth of the analytic situation emerges from the dialogue between two people. So even if the analysand is doing all the talking and the analyst is only occasionally interjecting, it's still the dynamic that sets itself up between those two that creates the truth of that encounter. And so in a strange way, I think that that's also the case with the cell. So even though it's impossible really for conservation reasons to let people walk through the cells at this point, part of it was this idea of seeing a situation both from within and from without. And in general, I would say with their art, Louise is attempting to, she wants to re-experience the trauma in order to abolish it. And beyond the pleasure principle, Freud talked about the fact that so many shell shock victims were having this sort of return, mental return to the most anguished moment of their life, to the origin of the trauma. And he didn't understand what it was exactly that they were attempting to do until he realized that it was attempting to relive the trauma in order to release themselves from it. And this was a largely unsuccessful attempt to liberate themselves from, the traumatic event that had made them who they were. And this is, I think, also true of Louise in a way that she said art is a form of psychoanalysis. And indeed, psychoanalysis and art become overlaid in Louise's work and at times seem almost indistinguishable from each other. But Louise never said that it was a cure. There was no cure. And I think psychoanalysis also does not purport to be a cure. It can do many things. It can alleviate your suffering. It can give you insight into why you're doing the things that you're doing. And, possibly you can use that information to live in a different way. But it's not some sort of quackery where you go to the psychoanalyst 3 times and then your back feels better. I mean, it was always something. It's much more labor intensive. And it's I think for Louise there was a kind of analogy in a strange way with between art, what art was for her. She saw being, to be an artist is really to be condemned to this life of repetition where you have no choice but to continue expressing yourself and sort of acting out your traumas.
In episode 9 of the podcast, I spoke with Abby-Winograd, the MacArthur-Fellows Program 40th Anniversary Exhibition Curator at the University of Chicago Smart Museum of Art. The MacArthur Foundation has a long history of providing quote-unquote genius grants for those that show great promise, including visual artists. Winograd was instrumental in bringing together the majority of MacArthur Artist Fellows to create work specific to and in conjunction with neighborhoods around Chicago, as well as coordinating an accompanying museum exhibit. Toward common cause, art, social change in the MacArthur Fellows Program at 40 raised questions about whether art is capable of creating social change.
What part of what I also was trying to do in thinking about this list of artists was look at kind of a spectrum of practice. And, very early on, the idea was that the foundational idea here is that all art is a form of social practice, and that happens across the spectrum, so that there are artists like Ida Applebrug and Nicole Eisenman and Carrie James Marshall who have spent decades trying to expand the canon of representation, and that is a form of social practice, and it happens in traditional art spaces. But that's foundationally important. I had the privilege of working with Carrie James Marshall on his retrospective when I was an intern, or I was a curatorial fellow at the MCA Chicago, and continued to work on that project as a research associate. And one of the things that project taught me was how fundamental representation within institutions is. So I wanted to make sure that there was that kind of a presence. But then, like you said, on the other end of that spectrum are the Melchins and the Rick Lowe's and Wendy Ewalds, these kind of artists who are doing work that's deeply embedded in community and that's produced that's context specific, that's produced by through community engagement, but that all of these types of artistic practice are fundamentally committed to an idea of that art is is capable of creating social change in various ways. And I do, the reason that I'm a curator is because I fundamentally believe that art has the power to change things, and that the visual encounter, the aesthetic encounter, is capable of